Well, they're very unhappy at these sanctions being reimposed on Iran. You have to understand that in diplomatic circles, the Iran nuclear deal of 2015 is really hailed as one of the greatest achievements in terms of diplomacy. And many of the member states here had a large part in getting this deal achieved. So the EU is really vowing to keep this deal alive. They say that it's in the interest of the economy, in the interest of the Iran's people, and it's also in the interest of international security. Listen to what Federica Mogherini, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, had to say about this.
We are doing our best to keep Iran in the deal, to keep Iran benefiting from the economic benefits that the agreement brings to the people of Iran, because we believe that this is the security interests of not only our region, but also of the world. If there is one piece of international agreements on nuclear non-proliferation that is delivering, it has to be maintained.
So that's for the diplomatic front. The EU will continue holding bilateral meetings and phone calls with the other parties in this deal to try to keep this deal alive. And on the economic front, well, you heard it in the story before, the EU has activated the so-called blocking statute, which is really an attempt to shield EU companies from the effects of those sanctions by, first of all, allowing EU companies to recover damages by suing the U.S. administration in front of EU courts, and secondly, by banning EU companies from having to comply with the U.S. Sanctions unless they're exceptionally authorized to do so by the EU. And that's where you see a little bit of room given to those companies, because it say that they can comply with the U.S. sanctions if they can prove that it's in their interest or in the interest of the EU. So we'll have to see how this is worked out in the next few months. The other thing that the EU will try to do is to try to find mechanisms for the second wave of sanctions that will, the second wave of U.S. sanctions that will start in November, and that will touch on Iran's oil. At the moment, 20% of Iran's oil is exported to the EU, so the EU is trying to find a way to continue this deal going on, potentially, for example, by using euros instead of dollars in these purchases.
Yeah, and Brian, it seems that with this, businesses are stuck between a rock and a hard place, because you have Brussels saying, okay, you're forbidden to comply with these sanctions, but that risks losing access to the U.S. market. So how is this going to play out?
Exactly, and that's a big dilemma. But at the moment, most analysts believe that the blocking statute will be very hard to implement. They don't really see EU courts suing companies just because they pulled out of Iran. And as I said, it will be easy for many of these companies to prove that pulling out of Iran was in their best interest, because in this global economy, when you use dollars, or if you want to have access to the U.S. market, well, it's a much bigger market than Iran, so it's easy to prove that it's the interest of your company. And actually, most of the companies have already made up their mind, whether it's the German Siemens, the French car maker PSA, the Danish Merckx. All these companies have said that they don't want to risk losing access to the U.S. market. They don't want to risk losing access to the financing in dollars by U.S. banks, and they don't also want to lose their U.S. shareholders. So for the moment, the choice is already made by most of these companies to pull out of Iran, despite the threat of EU to sue them for doing so.